Dr. Ziad grew up in the Tariq Rajab Museum environment. His father, an archaeologist and collector, also founded the New English School, where his son is now the director. His mother wrote a number of books over a wide variety of subjects, ranging from ethnic costumes in the museum collection to a book on Failaka Island, and included a cookbook and a book about the 1991 Iraqi invasion. Dr. Ziad experienced his parents' archaeological activities in Failaka and has been involved with various aspects of the museum and the school before he carried on their affair after passing. Dr. Ziad will be discussing another aspect of the museum collection entitled Glass and the Islamic World and the Tariq Rajab Museum. I mentioned that Dr. Ziad is the owner and director of the New English School. I understand from him that the students in the school are not supposed to be using mobile phones. Out of respect for him, please turn off your mobile phones and let's welcome Dr. Ziad Rajab.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Of course, I can't aspire to lofty figures like Sheikh Hissa, Sheikh Nasser, my parents too, in this field. I consider myself nothing like them. But Sheikh Hissa and the Dar management tonight was a real surprise. I knew there was something going on, but I didn't expect this. So it was a pleasure, a real honor, really. So thank you very much for inviting me to be with that wonderful group on the stage. People who have done so much for this organization, which is a huge, I think, one of the major cultural aspects of Kuwait. So I was very proud, actually, to discover that I was on the stage with these people. Thank you. Thank you all for coming here tonight. I have seen many familiar faces, which is nice because, well, it's comforting. And it's nice also to be back for the second time after COVID, because ever since COVID, we haven't known whether we were coming or going, and I'm glad we're going. And so tonight, now if you remember last year, if you were here last year, we ended the talk by a little mention about glass and glass objects in the early Islamic period. And so that was the reason why I decided just to pursue that avenue and look into the collection of glass that we have in the museum. Now we have quite an extensive collection in the museum. Some of it is on display in the galleries in Jabriya, but a lot of it actually is in storage. And so, yes, the title of this talk is Glass of the Islamic World in the Tariq Rajab Museum, but I've also, so I suppose it's generally that, but in general I'm going to talk about the role of glass during the early Islamic periods, and then I'm going to divert into something which perhaps has nothing really to do with any glass in our museum, which is stained glass, partly because of interest. And excuse my glasses. Now, glass is a material we use every day. Of course, we've got it here, and it's just a common material, and it's prominent in all our homes and our lives. And it has a very long and a very interesting, very varied history, originating, like other things, in the Middle East thousands of years ago, from where it spread to the rest of the world. As I said, the main focus today will be on glass from the Islamic period. So, but first I'll start off by talking about what glass is, how it could have been invented, and where scholars argue that it was most probably first invented. In Kuwait, of course, I think Sheikh Hassa has a beautiful collection of glass. I've seen lots of the lovely objects you have in the book, and so I have actually included some beautiful objects from that collection. And I think it was a very well-known scholar by the name of Stefano Carboni of the Metropolitan Museum of New York who actually wrote about the glass in the El Sabah collection with a colleague of his. And yes, and I said I'll talk about stained glass. Now, my father had a particular interest in stained glass. I like it too, but I think that's one of the reasons I included it. And he actually traveled around collecting stained glass from the Middle East, but which I'll tell you about later, but also from Europe, England. He had quite a bit of stained glass from England, which he installed in his home, in our homes, and various other places. And maybe maybe stained glass is important in the Islamic world because of the climate. Hot climate, so you want the light in, but you want to keep the heat out, so you make windows, colored windows, which will help to do that, and also add a lot of beauty. And just a note about the appearance of, so how does this work? Like this? The appearance of ancient glass objects, as you can see in this picture. Many objects look like this object does, iridescent, you know, with a sheen, a pearlescence on it. And of course, this is not original to the object, but rather a result of weathering over long periods of time. And over time, glass can deteriorate and a chemical deposit can form. And objects like this are actually quite difficult to restore or to clean. So, I mean, unless it's a very competent professional, one wouldn't really touch or try to remove any calcification or iridescence from an object. Now, it's argued by some scholars that glass was first invented in Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC, so between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. And the oldest glass objects, beads and such, these are beads from ancient Egypt, from ancient Mesopotamia, were found in both those two regions. And in Egypt, these pieces of glass were often used to decorate objects as inlay, and they've been found in many objects in tombs and so on. But more recently, scholars have argued that it's difficult to determine whether it was actually Mesopotamia that glass was first made or Egypt. And if you read different studies, the argument is always going back and forth in different directions. But most scholars do agree that glass was first made after a long period of experimentation with mixing silica sand, which is a quartz type of sand, with an alkaline substance. So that could be either plant-based or mineral, and the experiments may have resulted from working on glazes and ceramics workshops. The common alkali substance in the Middle East was soda ash, which, when added to the silica, brought down the silica sand mixture, would bring down the melting temperature. And soda could be sourced from the local plants of this region. So the type of desert plants, which I'm sure a lot of you will recognize, that we have in the area, which contain high levels of salts and bicarbonates as well as calcium oxide. And the calcium oxide made the glass more stable. In Egypt, the soda was taken from the salt lakes that were prevalent there, and the most famous lake is called Lake Natrun. And with much experimentation, glassmakers learnt how to color glass by adding metal oxides. So, for example, cobalt oxide would give you blue glass, while iron resulted in green. And a very interesting story about how glass was first discovered was told by Pliny the Elder, the famous Roman historian who wrote Naturalis Historia, an encyclopedia. And he related that some Phoenician soldiers who were carrying a shipload of natrum landed on a beach on the East Mediterranean coast, so somewhere between Tyre and Acre down there. But all the red dots are all ancient glass-making centers. So they landed on a river up there, and they wanted to light a fire and cook. And not finding any rocks on the beach to put around the fire, they used some blocks of natrum from their cargo. So that was the soda which was used in glass making. So this, when it came in contact with fine sand on the beach, melted and formed little beads of glass. So natrum, as I said, is a hydrated soda ash, a salt with several compounds. And Pliny, interestingly, mentions various Egyptian sites for collecting this natrum. This is, for example, a picture of a natrum lake in Egypt. And he indicated that Phoenician soldiers shipped it from Egypt to the glassworking centers along the Syrian coast. A nice story to believe, but modern scholars now believe that it's quite unlikely, as a cooking fire would never reach a temperature high enough to fuse the silicon glass together and natrum together to form glass. And a cooking fire burns at around 600 degrees centigrade, while for glass, to melt silica sand, you need around 1700. Again, back to the debate between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and to add to the debate, there was an important discovery in the 19th century, which was a collection of clay tablets in the Akkadian language, which at the time was the language of the Assyrians, from the Tel el-Amarna site in Egypt. And one of the tablets was a request by the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten for glass to be brought to him in Egypt. And this, according to the scholars, suggests that the glass had to be brought from elsewhere in those days, and in this case, from Akkadian-speaking Mesopotamia. So that was the tablet. More information on the clay cuneiform tablets was a letter from a local king on the Syrian hill. This is the letter, another cuneiform tablet. So a Syrian Palestinian coastal king called King Yidya, who was commenting on an order of glass for the pharaoh. So the King Yidya was writing to the pharaoh. And he stated, quote, "The king, having ordered some glass, I sent to the king 30 pieces. And who is the dog who would not obey the orders of the king, my lord, the sun from the sky, the son of the sun whom the sun loves?" So he was obviously paying tribute to the pharaoh. And according to an archaeological material science, Rachman, glass helped to tie empires together, and other archaeologists analyzing glass jewelry from a site in Egypt found that the glass, again, was most probably of Mediterranean origin. But having said that, in the 1300s, in a shipwreck off the Turkish coast, archaeologists found that there were glass ingots in the wreck, and they matched precisely the molds found in an Egyptian site. And so it's believed that a possibility was that the primary stage of glassmaking at the time might have been in one place, while the secondary stage would be in another. And with evidence from the Phoenician shipwreck, which was called Uluburum, a Caroline Jackson, a researcher, in her scholarly article on Bronze Age glassmaking, described a global economy with glass playing a key role in the trade. So much like the Silk Route a bit later on, glass played a key role in trade between Mesopotamia, between Egypt, the Greek areas, and the southern Turkish coast. So glass, parts of some materials could be sent to one place, one particular country or city could be known to make jewelry or to make a particular glass object. So there was a big, vibrant trade going on all around the region. And so the Phoenician ship, which was on a tribute-giving journey, was carrying along with its shipment of ivory, copper, tin, and amber, colored glass ingots. Well, these were the ones. And the ingots were mostly cobalt blue, such as here, but also some purple and turquoise ones. They were analyzed by scientists and found to be Egyptian in origin. And in Egypt itself, other archaeologists found evidence that different glassworks specialized in different colors, depending on what raw materials were available to them. So in Amarna, blue glass was produced, while in a place called Ghantir, another important glass center, it was red, while a place called Lish produced turquoise glass. And another very relevant archaeological discovery in pinpointing where glass was made is the tomb of Rachman in Thebes, Egypt. And in this tomb, there are paintings of glass vessels. This is the main painting. And these are objects that were not depicted ever before in earlier Egyptian paintings. And two of the vessels in the scenes depict tributes being given by Syrian chiefs who were offering glass objects, and scholars believe this could show the first man-made glass arriving in Egypt, coming originally from Syria or Mesopotamia. Rachman himself was a wazir under the pharaoh Thutmose III, who ruled in the 15th century BC. So this was the Syrians giving tribute, and this is just a clearer diagram of it. In another study sponsored by the Mosque Museum in Denmark, glass beads that were found in various parts of Europe were analyzed and were found to be made from Mesopotamian glass, dated between the 12th and 15th centuries BC. And others were found to be a mixture of Mesopotamian and Egyptian glass blended together. And the suggestion here was that the glass was actually blended in Mycenae, in Crete. But wherever it was first made, it was, in the beginning, a very, very luxurious item, only afforded by rulers, the elite, and the wealthiest. But by around the 15th century BC, glass production was becoming much more common in the Middle East, in Egypt, and in Crete. The Romans especially prized glass and would adorn their lavish banquets with glass vessels, which were even more valued than gold. And in fact, one Roman emperor, Nero, who was quite an extravagant, perhaps a murderous man, was very distraught on his deathbed that a particular glass object that he owned would not be his in the afterlife, and so he smashed it before he died, ensuring that it would not pass on to someone else, his successor. Now, this isn't the object, obviously, but, oh, sorry, that's Nero. This isn't the object, but I just put this in because it's such a beautiful vase made in, again, the Levant, Syria, but made in the Greek style and probably in the Roman market. And this is in a museum in Berlin. And another royal, Queen Cleopatra, was famous for her passion for millefiori, which is also known to glassmakers as mosaic glass. And she was reputed to have had 3,000 in her possession, which were apparently auctioned off after her death in Rome. So Millefiori is, so this is an Egyptian Millefiori bowl, which is in the Yale Museum, which is probably something similar to what she would have had. And such was the importance of glass at the time and the glass industry that in around 650 BC, there was an actual manual of glassmaking which was written in cuneiform on clay tablets during the reign of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. And one professor called Leo Oppenheim established that this actual manual was based on earlier tablets dating perhaps as far back as 2000 BC, the second millennium BC. The tablets are incredible in that they lay out a complete ceremonial process for establishing a glass kiln, a manufacturing center, and also the method of mixing materials. And for example, the next tablet, this one, is a description of how to make red glass. The next major development in glassmaking was made in the 1st century BC, which at the time was the Roman period in the Middle East. And glass workers there discovered that you could blow air through a pipe into melted or molten glass and produce a hollow vessel. And during the Roman period in Syria, it was also discovered that you could blow molten glass in a double-sided mold to produce vessels with decoration and inscriptions. The technique spread all over the Middle East, Persia, and the Western Roman world. So that's blowing glass. Probably one of the earliest and definitely the most famous known glass blower of that period was a Phoenician man called Ennion, who lived in the area around Sidon in today's Lebanon. What's incredible is that there are actually around 30 beautiful works of his which have survived to the present day and can be identified as his because he used to sign them in Greek, although his name was a Semitic Phoenician name. And for example, this is a beautiful vessel made by Ennion, which is in the Corning Museum of Glass in America. There are several other pieces in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is his signature, and that says Ennion made this. This is also his, which is from the Metropolitan Museum. And this beautiful jug, too. There's quite a comprehensive publication, actually. There's quite a bit written about Ennion, in which various conjectures are made about his origins, so meaning where did he work, and whether he actually emigrated from Lebanon, Syria, to Rome. And, of course, Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire, so that would have brought him close to the epicenter, where his works at the time were already recognized for their high quality. So it's not been established, but that's been the argument. There were several other Syrian glassmakers at the time who are known by name and who signed their objects, not as well known as Ennion, people like Ariston, Irenaeus, and Jason. One was called Artis, and he signed his name on the vessels as well as the name of his town, which was Sidon in southern Lebanon, in Greek and in Latin. And another glassmaker, Irenaeus, modeled a relief of the face of Augustus, like this, on his vessels. Another one, called Jason, a vessel of his was discovered in Lebanon, and contains an inscription framed with palms and written, "Jason made this, let the buyer remember." I haven't found a picture of the object, but I found this in a French publication from the 1950s. And this is very similar in style to the inscription by Ennion. Generally, early glass was opaque. It could be added by, it could be colored by adding oxides, as I said, cobalt and copper oxide producing shades of blue. But glass workers, either along the Syrian Palestinian coast or perhaps in Egypt, while experimenting with the addition of certain chemicals, discovered that you could make glass clear. So by adding manganese, a metal, a clearish type of glass was produced. But when you added antimony, the result was an almost crystal clear glass. Antimony is a metalloid substance, and it was used sometimes in medicine in ancient times. And it's actually the material that's used in kihl. The glass became known, this clear glass, became known during the Roman Empire as Alexandrian glass, leading scholars to believe that it was discovered in Alexandria, although there's no concrete proof of that. There's an interesting study, the aim of which was to try to determine the origin of antimony-treated glass by studying an isotope called hafnium, which occurs in differing levels in Egypt compared to the Levant. So the researchers, led by a Dr. Barford, stated that hafnium occurs in sediments from the Nile River, and that as the sediment flows out of the Nile into the Mediterranean and up the Levantine coast, it would settle in much lower quantities. So a lot of the research was based on fragments of glass excavated in Jerash. Now, when the Muslims conquered Syria and Palestine in the early 600s AD, there were already well-established ceramic, metal, and glass industries all over the region. And during the early Islamic period, there was, of course, a continuation of shapes and decorative motifs as well as techniques. And the original methods from Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia were carried further afield during this period. But during the Abbasid period, starting in the 800s, the 9th century, techniques were brought together. They were very skilled, as we know in many fields, of bringing techniques from all the far-flung regions of the empire and starting to produce a style which was considered a distinctive Islamic style. So this was the same with glass. In terms of motif and design, the engraved lines were done using the same techniques as with pottery. So circular tortoiseshell patterns, such as in this object here, which is like a rosewater sprinkler with tortoiseshell pattern. There are also many circular motifs. I've got a couple here, and they varied in their styles, being Hellenistic or Persian, Roman, and they were achieved by several different techniques of glass making, such as mold blowing, casting, appliquing. So this is a little glass vase with circular appliques. And then, well, there was a photo. Oh, I'm sort of going the wrong direction here. How do I go back? I've jumped a little too fast, sorry. And I'm supposed to be pointing there. I always do that. We're back to this one. Okay, so concave motifs, such as here. This is a blown object, but the concave facets were cut out inwards on the body. And then there was the trailing technique, which originated in Syria, and it's achieved by winding and stretching glass, when it's molten, of course, to form a long string, and which is then trailed on the body as a design form, such as at the top of the vase there. I think I've got the other pictures also to show the trailing on. This is a very heavily calcified object, so you can't really see the glass beneath it, but you can see the trailing down there quite clearly. as well as in this object, which is a romorphic object with trailing all up the center. Now, one of the earliest methods of working glass was the use of open molds in which molten glass was heated and pressed. So this is, for example, a mold in the Corning Museum, which has some designs on it. You'd press the molten glass into it, which you would then remove, and in this case, the different facets would be molded together, welded. And around 1500 BC, glassmakers in Mesopotamia and Egypt were making objects through a method called core forming, in which a vessel was made by trailing again, so taking a long length of molten glass over a core which was made of clay. And once the object was made, you'd scrape out the clay from the center, leaving a vessel, such as this one, which is like a jug. Then with casting, a closed mold, such as this. Bad picture, but that's a closed mold. So you'd pour the glass in and you'd shut it and you'd have your object. And it would be shaped, of course, to the mold. In the late Bronze Age, which is after 1500 BC, the method was used to make mosaic glass vessels. And after 1000 BC, another approach was used in which hot molten glass was poured over a former mold, such as here. So you'd melt the glass, you'd press it, and then you'd drop it over a shape which would give you perhaps a bowl or a vase, which would then be cleaned, of course, of the clay. Now, according to our researcher and writer, Carboni, two types of mold were used to produce mold-blown glass during the Islamic period. So there was the full mold, in which the glass object would remain the size of the actual mold itself. And then there was the dip mold, in which the molten glass was placed inside a decorated mold. The glass would then be removed and inflated with air, retaining the pattern of the mold. And there were many popular patterns at the time, like honeycomb, inscriptions, geometrical, floral patterns, and I've just, so that's a closed mold. And I've just got a few objects from the museum to show you, which were mold blown. These are from Iran, and this one actually has an inscription on it saying "Blessings to the owner," which isn't very clear to read, but it is there. This one, I've got a few pictures because I was trying to show you what a beautiful green this object is, but because it's calcified on the inside, it was very difficult to photograph, including this one, because this one has heavy calcification on the inside. These are all objects from the museum. As I said before, free-blown glass, which is what he's doing, was invented in Syria during the 1st century BC. Once a vessel was blown, it could be worked further by being cut or with pieces added to it. And while so when it's soft, it can be manipulated. They could also then add handles, feet, decorations, and the invention of this blowpipe in the 1st century enabled the manufacture of glass to become much, much faster, and so the cost of glass came down a lot. So most people after this could afford glass. After blowing, the glass makers would attach a rod to the bottom, so they'd take the top off, and then they'd be able to work while holding a rod called a pontil. And the pontils actually often left a mark, such as this. It's an object from the museum, but I've taken a picture of the bottom, which shows that it was made using a pontil, which is, of course, a method one can date glass to, as pontils were used after a particular period. Also, they could use pincers, so with some ancient objects you can find around the neck marks where the objects was held by pincers. Now, cut and engraved, oh sorry, I have some more pictures of free-blown vessels, which is what we were talking about. This one is a free-blown vessel with a trailing. These are all objects which are actually not on display in the museum, but we have in our store. I particularly like this because even though it's not originally a brown object, I like the color it's turned into. Now, cut and engraved glass. During the early Islamic period, cut and engraved glass became one of the most popular forms of working with the material. And the Fatimid workers, as with many other art forms, perfected the style of decoration. And the method was similar to that used to cut rock crystal, in which the Fatimids were very, very famous. They were very skilled, often producing exquisite works of art. And while the crystal vessels were very highly prized, glass was also sought after, albeit being less pricey versions than the crystal ones. There are various techniques of cutting and engraving glass. This is a beautiful beaker from the al-Sabah collection. And so, for example, they could use a diamond-mounted tool, a facet cut in which shallow dips were made, creating shallow facets. They could relief cut, in which the design was cut out and the design was protruding, with the background being removed. And cutting was a separate skill, so the glassmaker would make the glass object, but the cutter would be someone who would be using techniques similar to gem making, and so that was a very specific skill. These Fatimid cut rock crystal artifacts were considered a great luxury in Europe in the Middle Ages, and many were acquired and kept in palaces and in cathedrals throughout Europe. And where crystal was difficult to obtain, glass objects were sought after. And there are some outstanding works of art in various museums of cut glass and crystal, including a beautiful ewer in America in the Corning Museum of Glass, which has a fabulous collection, incidentally. And there are also beautiful objects in the V&A, and I've seen this several times because I think this is one of my favorite objects in the V&A, and whenever I go there, I always go to see this. It's cut crystal, that one. These are just little examples we have of glass that has been cut. This is a cut crystal beaker, a Fatimid one from the 12th century. This is a very special and a very rare type of vessel that's known in Europe as the Hedwig Glass. This is a type of vessel that was popular in Europe, and the name is derived from a lady called Saint Hedwig, who was the patron saint of Silesia, which is modern-day Poland. She was the wife of the Duke of Silesia, and the story goes that the Duke was very annoyed that his wife only drank water. She wouldn't drink wine at meal times. And getting up in anger one day to taste and to test the water in her glass, he was surprised to discover that while water had been poured into the glass, what was there was actually wine. And so that was considered a miracle, which is why she is a saint. And according to tradition, Hedwig owned 3 of these glasses. These are Egyptian in origin, although they've also suggested that they might have been made in Syria as well. They were made in the 11th and 12th centuries and were so special and sought after that Crusaders supposedly carried them back to Europe, where they ended up in palaces and in churches and cathedrals. Now, there has been a lot of debate about whether the vessels were actually made in Europe, because that's where most of them are found today, but chemical analysis shows that soda ash was used, which was very specific to the Middle East. There are only a few of these glasses still existing, all in various museums in Europe, such as this one in Poland. And they look like rock crystal, but they are actually glass. And the designs on the vessels are typical Fatimid designs, which include animals, birds, griffins, trees, plus geometric shapes and patterns. And some of the vessels even have Christian iconography on them, which indicates that some objects were probably made for the Christian market. Then we have luster, painted glass. Again, another lovely object from the Al-Sabah collection. Now, luster painted glass was made in Syria and Egypt quite early on in the Islamic period, around the 8th century. And luster on ceramics was, of course, invented during that period, either, again, back to our 2 regions, Mesopotamia or Egypt. They were painted on using a brush, and the paint was a substance mixed with a metal powder, such as copper or silver. Unfortunately, we don't have any in our museum of luster-painted glass. I know the Al-Sabah collection has some lovely luster. Which is this one example, and also this from the Al-Khalili collection. Now, there's been a lot of debate. I think we've spoken about it in the past, about the origin of lusterware, both on ceramic and on glass, with Iraq and Egypt being the 2 contenders. It's known both started at around the same time, although sometimes the color of luster differed from region to region. So in Syria, in Raqqa, for example, which was a very important ceramics and glass center, they produced dark brown luster with a blue underglaze, as well as some black with turquoise underglaze. And Damascus, it was slightly different, so they did blue and white as well as golden on a blue-stained glaze. Now, next is what I mentioned a little bit before, which is mosaic glass, or millefiori. Now, millefiori, as our Italian diplomats will know, is an Italian method of glass making that I'm sure most of you recognize. And in Italian, it simply means 1,000 flowers, and is made by using long molten strands of glass, which would be fused together, and then they'd cut off small pieces of the glass, put them in a mold, and make an object like a bowl. The technique was actually invented by the ancient Egyptians, then spreading across the Middle East and into the Roman Empire. And millefiori beads have been popular in the region since very ancient times. So during the Assyrian period, there were millefiori beads, which looked like some of these here, although these are Islamic ones. Beautiful pieces of millefiori tiles have been excavated from buildings in Samarra in Iraq, which was a very important city in the 9th century, and they had a very advanced glass industry. And one researcher called Nadine Shibil and her team provide evidence of the extensive use of glass as a decorative feature in Samarra at the time on walls, floors, ceilings, and in windows. And a lot of the glass used decoratively was mosaic glass, such as this. And yes, while it was invented in ancient Egypt, it's believed that the technique became less popular, even was forgotten, and then rediscovered in Iraq during the 8th century. Now this one, I know again, Sheikh Hassa has some lovely millefiori, sorry that's from Samara, as we see here in her collection. And here is another one in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which is an Iraqi 9th century millefiori bowl. As I said before, Cleopatra loved this particular type of glass. Then we have a marvered glass, like this. And to make marvered glass, colored trails of molten glass are applied to a vessel, while it's hot, of course, and they'd roll it on a marver. So a marver is a flat stone, like a table or a metal table. And so the trails of glass of one color are rolled into another object. And then the pattern could be further enhanced by combing. Oop. I keep going by mistake. So this is combed, for example, to produce that wave pattern. The technique was used in ancient Egypt again, and then further developed in Roman Syria, and was adopted by the Islamic glassworkers in Egypt and Syria, becoming very, very popular by the 12th century. And the style flourished during the Ayyubid and the Mamluk dynasties, which were in around the 12th up to the 16th century. And so we have a few objects here of marvered glass. This is like a giant bead. And this object, which we have in the museum, which is beautiful because it's translucent, it's a lovely color, but I haven't been able to establish a date for it. I'm looking into the records. But definitely an Islamic piece. And then perhaps even more luxurious than Islamic cut glass or cut crystal is enameled and gilded glass. Beautiful object here. Now, enameling is done by powdering or grinding glass, which can either be colored or a clear glass mixed with a pigment, and the powder is then mixed with a gum in order to be able to paint it. And once the design's been painted on, the vessel is fired, which is when the color usually appears. Colors could be applied separately, fired, and then another color added, or possibly the vessels would be painted completely and then fired in one go. Of course, achieving the high quality that was famous during the Ayyubid and Mamluk periods was possible only after a lot of experimentation. And glass such as this from Syria and Egypt was so famous that it was exported all over the Islamic world as well as to Europe and China. And Damascus enameled and gilded glass was particularly prized, and many pieces ended up in European treasuries. So we've got, for example, this in the British Museum, which is called the Palmer Cup, in a cathedral in France. And initially it was Syria that where it flourished most, but later on Egypt became more prominent. And for gilding, they'd apply small amounts of gold with a binder, which was then fused to the glass at a moderate temperature. So this is gilded as well. And there are fabulous examples in museums around the world. And this is an especially exquisite piece called the Luck of Edenhall. Now, this vessel was made in Syria or Egypt in the 14th century and is both enameled and gilded. It ended up in England, and while its journey to England is unknown, it's definitely known to have already been there by the 1600s, and some people say it did arrive there by around the 1400s. And it has an original leather case, which it came in, and which indicates how valuable the object was considered at the time. And the vase was owned by a family who lived in a house called Edenhall in Cumbria. This is the house, hence the name. And the object was called the Luck of Edenhall because it was originally thought by the English to have talismanic properties and to bring good luck. And such was the fame and the value of this object at the time that a German poet even wrote an ode to it. And this is from an 18th century magazine published. They published an article in which it was stated that some fairies, or jinns, shouted that if this cup should break or fall, farewell the luck of Eden Hall, which is what's written at the bottom there. And this is now in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum. That's it with its original leather casing. There are other fine examples, of course, as we said, in the Al-Sabah collection. There's some lovely, they were in there. I put two. These are enameled and gilded objects from the museum. This is a very, very fine example in Kuwait, in the Al-Sabah collection, as is this beautiful mosque lamp from Egypt, again, also in the Al-Sabah collection. And we have some later period enameled objects which are 18th century, such as this vase and this bowl, plus some also 18th century Indian ones which are gilded and painted, like these two here. I was going to talk to you about dating glass, which is very complicated. And I was going to, so you'll see two pictures about dating glass here, which is based on colors of these seals and stamps. But I've decided to skip that. Don't ask me why. I think it's because I found that I was going to talk for around 60 minutes, which is too long. So we say goodbye to our seals. But these were used by some researchers to date by color. So on from this, I'll talk to you a little bit about stained glass. Now, the ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians both used glass decoratively. This is just a beautiful mosque with stained glass in Persia. And they used it on walls and in floors. And the Romans actually might have been the first to use colored glass in windows, but the glass at the time in Rome was opaque, so it wouldn't let much light in. So it was more a decorative thing than a function of allowing light to come through too. But following on from the Romans, colored glass has been used on and off in Europe and the Middle East continuously after that. During the Islamic period, colored glass was in use very early on, and a significant source of evidence is in Syria, in an Umayyad palace, which is dated to the 8th century, and which was excavated by an archaeologist called Jean Lafond. Now, during the excavations, they found evidence of very elaborate stained glass all over the palace, and the colors were varied, including deep reds, violets, purples, greens, blues, whites, and they appear to have been mounted in a stucco framework, such as with this window here, with geometric and arabesque designs. Glass shards have been found at over a dozen other Umayyad desert palaces, and these palaces are often in locations where there was traditionally a glassworking industry. And for example, these two palaces, Qasr al-Hayr al-Sharqi in Syria, and Qasr al-Hayr al-Gharbi, amongst others. So there was glass for windows and for decoration found at both these palaces. And yet another researcher called Patricia Baker remarks that the palaces not only include intricate plasterwork and murals, but much colored glass windows and glass mosaics that were very likely created to make people marvel at the lavish decoration. Further evidence of the use of stained glass during the early Islamic period was at another important site called Khirbat al-Mafjar, which is this palace built in the early 8th century near Jericho in Palestine. The palace was actually very extensive and included, along with the main palace itself, a mosque, baths, and garden areas. And it was evident that colored glass windows were in use at the palace. The glass was set in stucco, as in that previous photo, and some of the windows have been reconstructed and put on display in a museum in Jerusalem. And yet another site is the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which was completed by 715 AD, and which was described by an Arab traveler called Ibn Jubayr, who wrote in the 12th century. He described the magical effect of the colored glass in the mosque coming from the mosque's 74 windows, which are in Arabic known as qamariyat. That's one term for them. There are other terms too. Glass floor tiles and stained glass have also been excavated at the palace of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mu'tasim in Raqqa in Syria. The glass was colorless with a slight green tinge. And further east, in another Abbasid palace, this time in Samarra in Iraq, glass, and that's the palace, an aerial view. Glass in the form of circular and lozenge-shaped cartouches was found and were thought to have formed a wall and floor panels. A lot of mosaic glass was also found, which was most probably, again, used on the wall panels. And there was another 9th century poet this time who wrote about the glass walls of the palace. He described them in the 9th century. And yet another traveler called Benjamin of Tudela, a Jewish traveler from Andalusia, speaks of a Syrian palace, the walls of which were clad with glass and perforated in places to allow the sun's rays to be admitted. And in the 10th century, a Hilal al-Sabbi mentioned the glass cutters employed in the Abbasid palaces alongside carpenters and paper makers. So, while, as I've said, glass has been used in windows since Roman times, it was really during the early Islamic period that the windows became more decorative, more sophisticated, with complex geometric and vegetal patterns in stucco and with specialist glass cutters employed specifically for that job. And then from the Eastern Islamic world, the fashion for the windows spread to Muslim Spain, and in the 10th century, glass mosaics and in windows were already used in the Great Mosque of Cordoba. And in Europe, there was also stained glass, which was used mostly in churches and cathedrals, whereas in the Islamic world, it was used in palaces, in homes, in baths, mosques, public buildings, all over, in fact. And in particular, it was the Abbasid period that became famous for this, and for the thinness and clarity of the glass. There's a palace called Qasr al-Banat, which was built by Harun al-Rashid as a summer residence. And large quantities of Raqqa, Syrian glass, were found there, excavated in the ruins. And in those days, it was predominantly the Syrian glass that was in high demand for buildings and for windows. And there is a researcher called Diane Dark who wrote a whole book about what she called Saracen art. So the book is called Stealing from the Saracens. And she describes how glass, amongst other things, came from the Middle East to famous European cathedrals and churches. So in churches, you have a window called a rose window, and she says, she claims after her research that the rose window was actually based on a 5th century church near Aleppo in Syria. Now in the Alhambra Palace in Granada, there were many elaborate window grills, such as in the Court of Myrtles, and this is a picture from Alhambra. And this type of window was first used by the Umayyads in Damascus, as I mentioned, in the Grand Mosque. And many other buildings in Arab Spain had the stained glass, and they're on display for visitors from all over Europe and the Middle East, including ambassadors, dignitaries, and so on. And it's thought that this was all done to impress them, and from there they took ideas back to their own countries. And I did mention Diane Dark. So in a National Geographic article published this year, in fact, in which the fire in the Notre Dame Cathedral was being discussed, they note that Diane Dark, the author who wrote Stealing from the Saracens, mentioned that the rose windows in the cathedral were copied, as I said, from a Syrian church called Qalb Lawzi, which is pictured here. That caused a lot of controversy and argument. But there was further evidence in Europe of influences from the Islamic world, from Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, who was an Arabic-speaking Sephardic Jew from Al-Andalus. And he visited Central Europe in the 10th century, and in particular Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia, which are known to have had for many centuries a very thriving and vibrant commercial life with very, very close relations with countries in the East. So they traded with Byzantium and with the Arab caliphates. And in his writings, he talks about the Arab traders who came often to Prague, and according to one Czech scholar, Karel Hertis, Arab and Middle Eastern glass were already being imported into Central Europe at the time, both as objects and also for stained glass use. And the gilded and enameled objects that we saw previously became very fashionable in Prague at the time. And by the 14th century, the Oriental influence on the locally made glass, the Bohemian glass, was already evident, and in particular the Syrian motifs. And later on, during the 17th century, the tide changes and European influences start going the opposite direction towards the Middle East and in the Ottoman Empire. And it's at this time that glass from the Muslim lands that are made in Muslim countries started to show a Bohemian influence. And actually the tide of trade direction had actually started before that with the import of Venetian glass into the Middle East in the 15th and 16th centuries. So after the Mongol invasions, in which cities in Iran, Iraq, and Syria were destroyed, the glass industry, of course, was destroyed along with many other industries. And the skilled glass workers taken to Samarkand, which is where many of them were settled. And there's early evidence of the import. So the import direction changed by this time, and Venetian glass was already coming into the Muslim world. And there's a famous lamp called Qaitbay's lamp, mosque lamp. Sorry, that was the travels. I just have this diagram of it, which is recognized as not being actually Egyptian, but most likely from Venice. So in Venice, they're already making things for the Muslim market. The lamp has very European floral designs on it. And there are many other lamps of a similar design and provenance in Egypt as well as in Syria. And more examples of Venetian glass in the East is in evidence in a very famous palace called the Sheki Khan Palace in Azerbaijan, which has the most beautiful stained glass windows, with the glass in the 18th century palace actually being imported from Venice. So the local people would shape the glass, which was Venetian, and insert it into an intricate, a very, very complicated wooden puzzle frame. I've seen a video about how they make it. It really is like a puzzle. So they cut all these little pieces of wood in a pre-designed design like this, and everything just slips into shape like one grand, complicated jigsaw puzzle. Now, another writer who indicated that there were many Middle Eastern influences in Europe was Sir Christopher Wren, of course, who was one of the most famous English architects, who he designed, of course, St. Paul's Cathedral, amongst many other buildings. And according to him, there were many early Christian and Islamic symbols and designs that came from the Middle East, and he incorporated some of these, what he called Saracen designs, into St. Paul's Cathedral. And he wrote a famous book called Parentalia, which was published posthumously, and he wrote extensively of this influence of Arabian and Saracen architecture and design on European design. And he said that Gothic art, which is, Notre Dame as a Gothic cathedral, should with more reason be called Saracen art. Of course, there wasn't much argument about this at the time, but in the 21st century there is a lot, which is such as when Diane Dark brought up this Middle Eastern origin theory. It caused a lot of unhappiness in various quarters. And there's more evidence of this Eastern influence and use of materials, again from Diane Dark, who was intrigued by what she saw as Middle Eastern influence in one of the oldest English churches, a Norman church in a village called Braebone in England. These are the Azerbaijan glasses. So that's the church. And she said that the stained glass windows in this 12th century church, the original ones, were actually Syrian glass. And so she invited a Syrian expert to investigate the window. They used a glass analyzer from London University, and they established that the raw materials of the glass were in fact Syrian in origin. And the glass contained the locked-in bubbles characteristic of Syrian plant ash glass. And similar glass is seen in other cathedrals around Europe, such as in Canterbury and York. And in the oldest cathedral in Britain, Canterbury Cathedral, 2 panels in the very famous south window of the cathedral were analyzed, and again found to have been Roman, Egyptian, possibly made in Rome, but with materials brought from Egypt. And I've run over. I shall quickly whiz you through. I just want to tell you, just to finish everything, about the qamariyat in Yemen. So the reason I'm mentioning them is because my father was so interested in qamariyat that he traveled to Yemen many times, commissioning works in Yemen. Sorry, that's the Braebone Window. Now the Yemenis, before stained glass, they were using alabaster for their windows, for their ceilings, because it would keep the heat out, but it would let light in. So the material, the white material in the middle there, is actually alabaster, which is a very fine marble type stone. But sometime around the 14th, 15th century, they say perhaps the early Ottoman, the late Mamluk period, they started to use glass. And this picture of my father, only one I found in Yemen, photographing the glass, the stained glass workers making the qamariyat. He imported a big quantity into Kuwait and installed them in buildings, all very much like this. So these are descendants of a very ancient tradition. And this is here in Kuwait, which has been, that's from actually the Calligraphy Museum. And they give a very nice effect when it's bright outside, and that's a domed ceiling. But he was also interested in English stained glass, which we see here. And we've got them in our houses, in his house, all over the place. And I was going to finish with this, but I'll just put you that picture of a lovely piece of stained glass. There's a story to it, but there's no time to tell it. So It's 8:10. I'm sorry I've kept you so long. I didn't realize, because I timed this, it was 50 minutes. So I must have waffled for too long. So thank you very much.